Charleston, South Carolina, 1851. The auction house stood on Chalmers Street like a temple to human cruelty. White columns rose from marble steps worn smooth by decades of suffering. Inside, beneath crystal chandeliers that sparkled with obscene elegance, human beings were sold like livestock. Margaret stood on the platform, her wrists bound with silk rope instead of iron chains. Even her restraints were meant to be beautiful. At 24 years old, she had been classified as a fancy girl, the most degrading category in the slave trade. Light-skinned, educated, considered beautiful by the standards of those who would buy her. She was about to be sold to the highest bidder, not for field work, not for domestic service, but for something far worse. The auctioneer, a portly man named Whitfield, smiled at the crowd of wealthy white men gathered before him. "Gentlemen, I present to you a rare offering. Margaret is literate, accomplished in music and French, trained in the finest social graces. She has been specifically prepared for refined company." Margaret kept her eyes fixed on a point above the crowd's heads. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made them enjoy it more. But inside, her mind was racing, calculating, searching for any possible escape. There was none. She had been born enslaved on a Virginia plantation, the daughter of an enslaved woman and the plantation owner who had assaulted her. Her light skin and her father's guilty conscience had earned her an education, reading, writing, music, languages. But when he died, his legitimate children had sold her south. Now she stood before 11 men who had formed a consortium. They called themselves the Gentlemen's Society. Each was wealthy, powerful, and morally bankrupt. They had pooled their resources to purchase her collectively, to share her among themselves. The bidding was brief. No one dared compete with 11 wealthy men united in purpose. Within minutes, Margaret belonged to them. The leader of the consortium stepped forward. His name was Nathaniel Blackwood, a banker with cold eyes and a reputation for cruelty disguised as civility. "Welcome to your new life, Margaret," he said, his voice smooth as silk and just as suffocating. "You will serve 11 masters now. Each of us has invested significantly in your purchase. We expect complete cooperation." Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze. "I understand." "Do you?" Blackwood smiled. "We shall see." They took her to a house on the edge of Charleston, a beautiful mansion surrounded by gardens and high walls. It looked like paradise. It was designed to be a prison. Inside, she was given a room that would have been luxurious under any other circumstances. Silk curtains, a 4-poster bed, fine furniture. But the windows had bars hidden behind decorative ironwork. The door locked from the outside. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. "My name is Caroline," she said softly. "I manage this household. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're feeling. But I need you to listen carefully if you want to survive this." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling despite her attempts at composure. "How long have you been here?" 20 years, Caroline replied. "I was purchased by Blackwood's father for the same purpose you're here for. When I aged out of their interest, they kept me on to run the house, to prepare the girls who came after me." "How many have there been?" Caroline's face became a mask of pain. "You're the 7th in my time here. The others." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. "What happened to them?" "Some got pregnant and were sold away. Some went mad and were sent to asylums. One killed herself." Caroline's voice was barely a whisper now. "And one was smart enough to escape. But that was years ago. Security is tighter now." Margaret felt ice in her veins. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're different from the others," Caroline said, studying her carefully. "I can see it in your eyes. You're not broken yet. You're thinking, planning. And I want you to know that if you're clever enough, if you're strong enough, there might be a way out of this." "What way?" Caroline glanced at the door, then lowered her voice even further. These men are powerful, rich, but they're also arrogant. They think their money makes them untouchable. They think you're just property with no mind, no will, no ability to fight back. Aren't I? Margaret asked bitterly. No, Caroline said firmly. You're educated. You know things they don't think you should know. You can read, write, calculate, and most importantly, you can listen. These men will talk freely around you because they think you don't matter. They'll reveal their secrets, their business dealings, their vulnerabilities. Margaret's mind began to work. You're saying I should gather information. I'm saying knowledge is the only weapon you have. Use it wisely. Caroline stood to leave. The first master arrives tomorrow evening. Mr. Blackwood himself. Be respectful, be compliant, and pay attention to everything. After Caroline left, Margaret sat alone in her gilded cage. She thought about the 6 women who had been here before her. She thought about the one who had escaped, and she thought about the 11 men who believed they owned her. They were wrong. They might own her body by the brutal laws of this nation, but her mind was her own. Her will was her own, and she would use both to destroy them. The next evening, Nathaniel Blackwood arrived at the mansion with the casual confidence of a man who had never been denied anything. He brought wine, expensive gifts, and the assumption that Margaret would be grateful for his attention. Margaret played the part they expected. She was demure, soft-spoken, attentive. She poured his wine with steady hands and listened as he talked about his day. And Blackwood, like Caroline had predicted, talked freely. He complained about his business rivals. He boasted about a recent deal that had enriched him at the expense of several smaller investors. He mentioned a judge he had bribed, a politician he owned, a competitor he was planning to ruin. Margaret absorbed every word, filing it away in her exceptional memory. When he finally left, she sat down and wrote everything in a small journal she had found in the room. She wrote in French, knowing that most people who might find it wouldn't be able to read it. The second master came 3 days later. His name was Richard Caldwell, a cotton merchant with a reputation for ruthless business practices. He was younger than Blackwood, more volatile, easier to anger. He too talked freely, about ships he owned that were really owned by shell companies, about cotton he sold that was stolen from smaller plantations, about debts he collected through intimidation and violence. Margaret listened, remembered, wrote it all down. The third master was Judge Marcus Thornton. The irony of being assaulted by a man who sat in judgment of others was not lost on Margaret. But Thornton was also the most valuable source of information. He talked about cases he had decided based on bribes rather than law, about innocent men he had sentenced to satisfy political allies, about legal loopholes he had created to protect the wealthy. Margaret's journal grew thicker. The pattern continued over the following months. 11 men, each believing himself powerful and untouchable, each revealing his secrets to a woman they considered less than human. But Margaret was learning something else too. She was learning their fears. Blackwood feared poverty more than death. He had grown up poor, and his entire identity was built on his wealth. The thought of losing it terrified him. Caldwell feared irrelevance. He needed to be seen as important, powerful. His ego was his weakness. Thornton feared exposure. His entire career was built on a reputation for integrity that was entirely false. If the truth came out, he would lose everything. Each man had a vulnerability. Each vulnerability was a weapon. But collecting information wasn't enough. Margaret needed a plan, a way to use what she knew without getting herself killed in the process. The answer came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, while Caroline was helping her dress, Margaret noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small scar on Caroline's wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve. "What happened?" Margaret asked. Caroline pulled her sleeve down quickly. "Nothing." "Caroline, please, if we're going to trust each other." The older woman sighed. I told you one girl escaped. What I didn't tell you was that I helped her. I gave her money, contacts, a route north. When they found out, Blackwood's father did this. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing a brand mark. To remind me of the consequences of betrayal. Margaret stared at the scar, feeling rage build in her chest. And yet you're helping me now. Because I'm tired of watching girls die here, Caroline said, her voice fierce. Because I'm old enough now that they won't kill me. I'm too useful managing the house. And because you might actually be smart enough to pull this off. Pull what off? Caroline leaned close, destroying them, all of them, using their own greed and arrogance against them. How? There's a man in Charleston, a newspaper editor named Thomas Whitmore. He's sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, though he has to be careful about it publicly. He's been investigating corruption in the city for years, but can never get enough evidence to publish anything damaging. Margaret's heart began to race. And I have evidence. Exactly, but you can't just hand it to him. They trace it back to you immediately. You need to be smart about it, strategic. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Caroline developed a plan. It was dangerous, complex, and required perfect timing, but it was possible. Margaret would continue gathering information, documenting every secret, every crime, every vulnerability. But she would do more than that. She would subtly manipulate the masters against each other, planting seeds of distrust and competition. Meanwhile, Caroline would establish contact with Thomas Whitmore through trusted intermediaries. They would feed him information gradually, in ways that couldn't be traced back to the mansion. And when the time was right, when they had enough evidence and enough chaos, Margaret would make her move. It would take months, maybe years. It would require patience, courage, and perfect execution. But Margaret had something the 11 masters didn't expect. She had nothing left to lose. 6 months into her captivity, Margaret had filled 3 journals with secrets. She knew which of the masters were embezzling from their own companies, which ones were bribing officials, which ones had committed crimes ranging from fraud to murder. She knew that Blackwood was secretly bankrupt, maintaining his lifestyle through increasingly desperate schemes, that Caldwell's shipping business was a front for smuggling, that Judge Thornton had accepted bribes in a murder trial that had sent an innocent man to hang. And she had begun to use that knowledge. During conversations with the masters, she would carefully, subtly mention things she overheard or accidentally learned. She would tell Blackwood that Caldwell was planning to invest in a rival bank. She would mention to Caldwell that Blackwood had spoken poorly of his business acumen. She would let Thornton know that the others questioned his usefulness to their consortium. Small seeds of doubt, tiny fractures in their alliance. The first real crack appeared when Blackwood and Caldwell had a massive argument over a business deal gone wrong. Each blamed the other. Both threatened to withdraw from the consortium. Margaret watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. But she also knew she was playing a dangerous game. If they discovered what she was doing, they would kill her. There would be no mercy, no hesitation. So she had to be perfect, every move calculated, every word measured. And she had to be patient. Because revenge, real revenge, couldn't be rushed. It had to be devastating. Winter came to Charleston, bringing cold winds from the harbor and a false sense of security to the 11 masters. They believed they had broken Margaret. After 8 months, she had learned to smile at the right times, to laugh at their jokes, to play the role of the compliant, grateful slave. They had no idea she was destroying them piece by piece. Margaret sat in her room on a December evening, reviewing her latest journal entries by candlelight. She had developed a system, coded notes that looked like poetry or religious reflections if anyone found them, but which she could decode to reveal the devastating truths she'd collected. Caroline entered quietly, as she always did, carrying Margaret's evening meal. "Mr. Harrison is coming tonight," Caroline said. Harrison was the fourth master, a railroad magnate with political ambitions and a violent temper. "I know," Margaret replied. "He mentioned it last week. He wants to discuss the upcoming election." Caroline set down the tray and lowered her voice. "Thomas Whitmore published his first article yesterday about corruption in the Harbor Commission. 3 men resigned this morning." Margaret's pulse quickened. Did it work? Could they trace it back here? No, Whitmore protected his source perfectly. But Margaret, those 3 men, they were associates of Blackwood and Caldwell. The masters are already suspicious of each other. This was exactly what Margaret had hoped for. The first public blow had been struck, and the masters were turning on each other rather than looking for an external enemy. "Good," Margaret said quietly. "Let them destroy each other from within." That night when Harrison arrived, he was already agitated. He paced Margaret's room, drinking heavily, ranting about the Harbor Commission scandal. "Someone talked," he growled. "Someone gave that damn newspaper information, if I find out who it was." Margaret poured him more wine, her hand steady. Perhaps it wasn't someone from inside. Perhaps the commission members were simply careless. "Careless?" Harrison laughed bitterly. "Blackwood and Caldwell are never careless, unless—" He stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Unless one of them is playing both sides." Margaret said nothing, but she could see the seed taking root. Harrison was already suspicious of his fellow consortium members. It would only take a few more carefully placed suggestions to turn suspicion into open hostility. Over the next few weeks, Margaret continued her work. She had learned each master's schedule, their habits, their weaknesses. She knew when they would be vulnerable and when they would be receptive to her subtle manipulations. The fifth master, Dr. Edmund Ashford, was a physician who had made his fortune through what he called medical innovation, experimentation on enslaved people without consent or anesthesia. He was perhaps the most repulsive of all the masters, but he was also the most vulnerable. During one of his visits, Margaret carefully steered the conversation toward his experiments. "You must be very careful," she said softly, "if people knew the full extent of your research." "People are fools," Ashford replied dismissively. "They don't understand that progress requires sacrifice." "But what if someone kept records, documentation of the subjects?" Ashford's face went pale. "There are no records, I made sure of that." But Margaret had seen him lie before, and the way his hand trembled told her everything she needed to know. There were records, and they were hidden somewhere in his medical office. She filed that information away. It would be useful later. The sixth master was Colonel James Warfield, a retired military officer who now ran a private security company, essentially a gang of slave catchers and enforcers who terrorized the black community. He was brutal, efficient, and completely without conscience. But he was also paranoid. "Someone is watching me," he confessed to Margaret one evening. "I can feel it. Someone is investigating the society." Margaret feigned concern. "What makes you think so?" "Little things, questions being asked, people following my men. And that newspaper," he slammed his fist on the table. "That damn editor is digging where he shouldn't be." "Perhaps you should speak to Judge Thornton," Margaret suggested innocently. "Surely he could do something about a troublesome newspaper." Warfield's eyes lit up. "Of course, Thornton owes us. He can shut this down legally." But Margaret knew that Thornton was already under pressure. 2 more of Whitmore's articles had exposed judicial corruption, and while Thornton hadn't been named directly, he was feeling the heat. If Warfield pushed him to act against the newspaper, it would create friction, more cracks in their alliance. Everything was falling into place. But then something happened that Margaret hadn't anticipated. One of the other masters, the 7th, a textile manufacturer named Robert Crane, arrived at the mansion unannounced one afternoon. He was drunk, disheveled, and clearly distraught. Caroline tried to turn him away, but he pushed past her and went straight to Margaret's room. You did this, he slurred, grabbing Margaret's arm roughly. You're behind all of this, aren't you? Margaret's heart hammered, but she kept her voice calm. I don't know what you mean, sir. The newspaper, the investigations, the consortium falling apart, it started when you arrived. His grip tightened painfully. What did you tell them? What did you do? Caroline appeared in the doorway. Mr. Crane, you need to leave. You're not scheduled. Shut up, Crane backhanded Caroline across the face, sending her stumbling backward. Something snapped inside Margaret. For 8 months she had been patient, calculating, playing the long game. But watching Crane strike Caroline, this woman who had shown her kindness, who had risked everything to help her, ignited a fury she could no longer contain. You want to know what I did? Margaret said, her voice cold and steady now. She pulled her arm from his grip. I listened, that's all. I listened to 11 arrogant men brag about their crimes and their cruelty, and I remembered every word. Crane's eyes widened. He reached for her, but Margaret was faster. She grabbed the heavy candlestick from her bedside table and brought it down hard on his wrist. The crack of breaking bone was satisfying. Crane screamed, stumbling backward, clutching his wrist. You're right about one thing, Margaret continued, her voice shaking with rage now. It did start when I arrived, but it won't end until all of you are destroyed, until the world knows exactly what you are. Crane lurched toward the door, but Caroline was blocking it now, her hand pressed to her bleeding lip, her eyes blazing with the same fury Margaret felt. You shouldn't have come here alone, Caroline said quietly. You shouldn't have hit me, because now you've given us what we needed. What's that? Crane spat. A reason, Margaret said. Crane tried to push past Caroline, but she didn't move. And when he raised his good hand to strike her again, she caught his wrist and twisted. Years of suppressed rage and pain gave her strength she didn't know she had. Crane fell, his head striking the door frame on the way down. He lay still. For a long moment, neither woman moved. Then Caroline knelt beside Crane and checked his pulse. He's alive, she said, but unconscious. Margaret's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline leaving her system. What do we do? Caroline stood, her expression hardening into something Margaret had never seen before. We accelerate the plan. We can't wait anymore. Crane will tell the others what happened here. They'll know you're not broken. They'll kill you. Then I run. No, Caroline met her eyes. Then we finish this. Tonight, we give Whitmore everything we have and we burn these men to the ground. Margaret thought about her 3 journals, hidden in a hollowed-out Bible in her room. She thought about all the evidence she'd gathered, all the secrets she'd learned. It wasn't everything she'd hoped to collect, but it might be enough. How do we get the journals to Whitmore? Caroline smiled grimly. I have a contact, a free black man who works at the newspaper. He's been waiting for my signal. But Margaret, once we do this, there's no going back. The masters will know it was us. We'll have to run. Where? North. I have money saved, contacts on the Underground Railroad. We can make it, but we have to move fast. Margaret looked at Crane's unconscious form on the floor. Then she looked at Caroline, this woman who had endured 20 years in this hell, who had survived, who had helped others even at great cost to herself. Let's do it, Margaret said. They worked quickly. Caroline had 2 men she trusted, freedmen who worked on the property, helped them move Crane to a cellar and secure him there. It would buy them a few hours before the other masters realized something was wrong. Margaret gathered her journals and wrote one final entry, a comprehensive index that would help Whitmore understand the full scope of what he was receiving. Then she helped Caroline pack essential supplies, money, food, warm clothes, and forged freedom papers Caroline had been slowly creating over the years. As the sun set, Caroline's contact arrived, a dignified older man named Solomon who worked as a typesetter at Whitmore's newspaper. This is everything, he asked, carefully wrapping the journals in oilcloth. Everything, Margaret confirmed. Names, dates, crimes, business dealings, enough to destroy all 11 of them. Solomon's eyes were bright with emotion. You've done a brave thing, child, a dangerous thing, but a necessary one. Will Mr. Whitmore publish it? He's been waiting for evidence like this for years. Oh yes, he'll publish it. And when he does, it will shake Charleston to its foundations. After Solomon left, Margaret and Caroline prepared for their own escape. They would leave at midnight when the house was quiet and the streets were dark. They would make their way to the harbor, where another contact would hide them on a ship heading north. But at 11 o'clock, everything went wrong. The sound of horses and shouting men filled the air outside. Margaret looked out the barred window and her blood ran cold. All 10 remaining masters had arrived, along with Colonel Warfield's private security force. 20 armed men surrounded the house. They found Crane, Caroline whispered. Someone must have heard him in the cellar. Nathaniel Blackwood's voice boomed from outside. Margaret, Caroline, we know what you've done. Come out now and we'll make this quick. Hide and we'll burn the house down with you in it. Margaret looked at Caroline. The journals are already gone. Even if they kill us, the truth will get out. That's not good enough, Caroline said fiercely. We're not dying here, not after everything. Then what do we do? Caroline's eyes swept the room, calculating. Then she smiled, a hard, determined smile. We do what you've been doing all along. We use their arrogance against them. She moved to the window and called down. Mr. Blackwood, we'll come out, but we want your word that you'll hear us out first. Blackwood laughed. You want to negotiate, you have nothing to bargain with. Don't we? Caroline shouted back. Margaret has been collecting your secrets for 8 months. Do you really think she kept all that information in journals? She's memorized everything. Kill her, and you'll never know what else she told, who else knows, what other evidence exists. There was a long silence. Margaret could see the masters conferring, arguing. Finally, Blackwood spoke again. You have 5 minutes. Say what you need to say. Caroline pulled Margaret away from the window. Listen carefully. I'm going to go downstairs and talk to them. While I do, you're going to escape. How? The tunnel, the one you haven't found yet. Caroline moved a rug aside, revealing a hidden trapdoor. This house has been used for this purpose for 40 years. The original owner built escape routes, not for the enslaved women, of course, but for himself if the law ever came calling. The tunnel leads to the harbor. Come with me, Margaret pleaded. I can't, I'm too old, too slow, I just slow you down. Caroline grabbed Margaret's shoulders. But you can make it. You're young, strong, smart. You can survive this and tell the story. Make sure the world knows what happened here. Caroline. Go, Caroline pushed her toward the trapdoor. Live, Margaret. Live and fight and make sure these bastards pay for everything they've done. Margaret climbed down into the darkness, tears streaming down her face. Above her, she heard Caroline replace the rug and the trapdoor. Then she heard Caroline's footsteps heading downstairs to face the masters alone. The tunnel was pitch black and narrow, the walls damp and close. Margaret crawled forward on her hands and knees, her breath coming in short gasps, tears still streaming down her face. Behind her, muffled by earth and distance, she could hear raised voices. Caroline's clear and defiant, Blackwood's full of rage. Then a gunshot. Margaret stopped, her whole body going cold. No, no, please no. But she couldn't go back. Caroline had sacrificed herself so Margaret could escape. She had to honor that sacrifice, had to survive, had to make sure the truth got out. Margaret forced herself to keep moving. The tunnel seemed endless, but finally she saw a faint light ahead. She emerged into a narrow alley near the Charleston harbor, the smell of salt water and fish sharp in the cold night air. She was free. But Caroline was dead, and 11 powerful men would be hunting her with everything they had. Margaret had no time to grieve. She pulled up the hood of her cloak and walked quickly through the dark streets, heading for the address Caroline had made her memorize. a boarding house near the docks run by a free black woman who helped runaways. The woman, Mrs. Adelaide Thompson, opened the door at Margaret's desperate knock. She took one look at Margaret's tear-stained face and pulled her inside without a word. "You're her," Mrs. Thompson said simply, "the one Caroline told me about." "They killed her," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She stayed behind so I could escape." "And they killed her." Mrs. Thompson's face was hard with grief and anger. Caroline knew the risks. She's been planning this for years, and she made sure you had everything you needed to finish what she started. She led Margaret to a small room in the back of the house. "You can't stay long. They'll be searching every building in the Black Quarter by morning, but Solomon left something for you." On the small table was a note in Solomon's handwriting. "The journals are with Whitmore. He's already begun writing. The first article publishes tomorrow. By the time they realize what's happening, the truth will be unstoppable. Stay safe, stay hidden, and wait for the world to change." Margaret clutched the note to her chest. Caroline hadn't died for nothing. The truth was already spreading. The next morning, the Charleston Mercury published an article that would change everything. Corruption exposed, the Gentlemen's Society revealed. Thomas Whitmore had worked through the night, translating Margaret's French notes and organizing the evidence into a devastating exposé. The first article focused on Nathaniel Blackwood, revealing his embezzlement, his bribes, his secret bankruptcy. Within hours, there was panic at Blackwood's bank. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Business partners demanded audits. The police, those not already bribed, began asking questions. Blackwood tried to suppress the article, to threaten Whitmore, to use his influence. But Whitmore had been careful. He had sent copies of the evidence to newspapers in Richmond, Atlanta, and Washington. The story was already spreading beyond Blackwood's control. The second article came the next day, exposing Richard Caldwell's smuggling operation and illegal shipping practices. Federal authorities raided his warehouses. Ships were impounded. Caldwell fled the city, leaving behind debts and angry business partners. The third article revealed Judge Marcus Thornton's corruption. The innocent man he had sent to hang for murder, the bribes he had accepted, the cases he had fixed. Public outrage forced the governor to suspend him pending investigation. One by one, the articles came. Dr. Ashford's horrific medical experiments were exposed, leading to the closure of his practice and criminal charges. Colonel Warfield's security company was revealed to be nothing more than a criminal gang, resulting in multiple arrests. The consortium was imploding. But the masters weren't going down quietly. They pooled their remaining resources and hired bounty hunters to find Margaret. The reward they offered was staggering: $5,000 for her capture, dead or alive. Margaret spent 3 weeks hiding in Mrs. Thompson's boarding house, moving between hidden rooms, never staying in one place for more than a day. She listened to the reports that Mrs. Thompson brought her, each new article published, each master's downfall, each victory for truth over power. But she also heard the darker news. Bounty hunters were ransacking the Black Quarter, arresting anyone suspected of helping her. 3 people had been beaten. 1 had died. "I can't stay here," Margaret told Mrs. Thompson one evening. "I'm putting too many people in danger." "You're putting the truth out there," Mrs. Thompson countered. "That's worth the risk." "Not if innocent people die for it." Mrs. Thompson was quiet for a moment. "There's a ship leaving for Philadelphia in 2 days. The captain is sympathetic. He can hide you in cargo. From Philadelphia, you can reach the Underground Railroad and get to Canada." "And then what? I spend the rest of my life hiding while these men continue to hurt people." "Those men are finished, child. You've already destroyed them." "Not all of them," Margaret said. She had been thinking about this constantly. 7 of the masters are exposed, disgraced, facing legal consequences, but 4 remain untouched. Whitmore hasn't published articles about them yet. Perhaps he doesn't have enough evidence. Margaret shook her head. I gave him evidence on all 11. If he hasn't published it yet, there must be a reason. She borrowed paper and ink from Mrs. Thompson and wrote a careful letter to Thomas Whitmore, using a code that Solomon had taught her. The next morning, Solomon himself arrived with Whitmore's response. He wants to meet you, Solomon said, tonight at the newspaper office. It was dangerous, possibly a trap, but Margaret had to know why the final 4 masters hadn't been exposed. That night, disguised in men's clothing borrowed from Mrs. Thompson's son, Margaret made her way through the dark streets to the newspaper office. Solomon led her through a back entrance and up to a cluttered room where Thomas Whitmore waited. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. He stood when she entered, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. Miss Margaret, he said, you've done something remarkable and incredibly dangerous. Why haven't you published the information on the last 4 masters? She asked directly. Whitmore sighed. Because those 4 are different, more powerful. Senator William Graves has connections in Washington that could shut down my newspaper and have me arrested for sedition. Marcus Webb owns half the cotton trade in the South. Destroying him would collapse the economy of 3 states. Reverend Jonathan Price runs the largest church in Charleston. He has the entire religious community behind him. And then there's Harrison, Margaret finished, the railroad magnate with political ambitions. Exactly. These men have protection that the others didn't. Exposing them requires more than evidence. It requires perfect timing and absolute proof that even their powerful friends can't ignore. Margaret sat down heavily. So they win after everything. Not necessarily. Whitmore pulled out her journals. Your documentation is extraordinary, but I need something more. Something that would make their prosecution mandatory. Something their protectors can't sweep away. Like what? Like testimony from a victim. Someone willing to stand up in court and tell the truth, even knowing the cost. Margaret's blood ran cold. You're asking me to testify publicly, to reveal myself. I know what I'm asking, Whitmore said quietly, and I know it's unfair. You've already given so much, risked so much, but you're the only one who can do this. Your testimony, combined with the documentary evidence, would make prosecution inevitable. They'll kill me. They'll try, but there are people who will protect you. Abolitionists, lawyers, journalists, we're organizing, building a movement. If you come forward, you won't be alone. Margaret thought about Caroline, who had died to give her this chance. She thought about the 6 women before her who had suffered in that mansion. She thought about all the people still enslaved, still suffering, because men like the final 4 masters maintained their power. When, she asked. A federal prosecutor arrives from Washington next week. He's already reviewing the evidence on the first 7 masters. If you testify to a grand jury, they can indict the final 4. And if I don't? Whitmore met her eyes honestly. Then those 4 men continue their lives with barely a scratch. They'll be more careful, more cautious, but they'll survive, and others will suffer because of it. Margaret spent 3 days wrestling with the decision. Mrs. Thompson argued against it. Solomon suggested waiting until she was safely in Canada. Even Whitmore said he would understand if she refused. But Margaret kept coming back to one truth. She had started this fight. She had to finish it. On a cold January morning, Margaret walked into the federal courthouse in Charleston. She wore her finest dress, one of the garments the masters had provided to make her more presentable. The irony wasn't lost on her. Word had spread that she would be testifying. The courtroom was packed with journalists, abolitionists, curious onlookers, and, she knew, agents of the 4 remaining masters. The prosecutor, a serious man named Daniel Wade, approached her before the proceedings began. Miss Margaret, I want you to understand what's about to happen. These men will try to destroy your credibility. They'll call you a liar, a criminal, property with no right to testify. They'll make this as painful as possible." "I understand," Margaret said. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "And I want you to know that regardless of what happens here today, you've already accomplished something extraordinary. You've exposed corruption that most people thought was untouchable. You've given voice to people who had none." "Will it be enough?" Margaret asked. Wade smiled grimly. "Let's find out." The grand jury proceedings were supposed to be private, but somehow details leaked immediately. Margaret spent 4 hours answering questions, providing testimony about each of the 11 masters, detailing their crimes and their cruelty. She spoke about being sold as a fancy girl, about the consortium's purpose, about 8 months of enduring horror while collecting evidence. She named names, cited dates, provided specifics that corroborated the documentary evidence. And when the defense lawyers tried to dismiss her testimony because she was enslaved and therefore couldn't legally testify against white men, Wade pulled out documentation that Margaret hadn't known existed. "Miss Margaret was freed 6 weeks ago," Wade announced, "by an anonymous donor who purchased her from the consortium's estate and immediately manumitted her. She is a free woman, and her testimony is legally admissible." The courtroom erupted. Margaret sat in stunned silence. Free. She was legally free. Later, she would learn that Thomas Whitmore and a group of abolitionists had pooled their money to purchase her freedom. It had been done in secret, through intermediaries, to prevent the masters from blocking it. But in that moment, all she felt was a weight lifting from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she was no longer property. The grand jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they handed down indictments against all 4 remaining masters. Senator William Graves for bribery, corruption, and conspiracy. Marcus Webb for human trafficking, fraud, and racketeering. Reverend Jonathan Price for embezzlement from his church and complicity in the consortium's activities. And Samuel Harrison for assault, corruption, and attempting to bribe federal officials. The arrests were made simultaneously to prevent any of them from fleeing. Margaret watched from a safe distance as each man was led away in chains. The same chains that had bound her for 8 months. The irony was beautiful. But even as the masters fell, Margaret knew the battle wasn't over. The trials would take months. The defendants would hire the best lawyers money could buy. They would fight with everything they had. And Margaret would have to testify again, this time in open court, where everyone could see her and hear her story. She was ready. The trial began on a humid April morning, 3 months after the indictments were handed down. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters, some supporting the defendants, claiming the prosecution was an attack on Southern values and property rights, others demanding justice, carrying signs calling for the end of slavery. Margaret sat in a witness room, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the chaos outside. Thomas Whitmore sat beside her, reviewing her testimony notes one final time. "They're going to try to break you," he said. "The defense will paint you as a vindictive woman seeking revenge. They'll question your character, your motives, everything about you." "Let them," Margaret said. "The truth doesn't change based on what they think of me." The door opened and Prosecutor Daniel Wade entered. "We're ready for you." Margaret stood, smoothing her dress. It was simple, modest, carefully chosen to present her as credible and dignified. She walked into the courtroom with her head high. The room fell silent as she entered. Every eye turned to her, the woman who had brought down 7 powerful men and was now threatening to destroy 4 more. She took her seat in the witness stand and was sworn in. Wade approached with a gentle smile. "Miss Margaret, please tell the court how you came to be in Charleston." And Margaret began to speak. She told her story simply, without dramatization. She explained her birth into slavery, her sale to the consortium, her arrival at the mansion. She described the role she had been purchased for, using clinical language that made several people in the courtroom flinch. Then she detailed what she had done, how she had listened and learned, how she had documented crimes and corruption, how she had worked with Caroline to expose the truth. "And Miss Margaret," Wade asked, "when you collected this information, what was your motivation?" "Survival at first," Margaret answered honestly. "I thought if I knew enough, I might find a way to escape. But as I learned more about what these men were doing, not just to me but to countless others, it became about justice." "Can you provide specific examples of the crimes you witnessed or learned about?" Margaret could, and she did. She testified about Senator Graves bribing a federal land agent to acquire territory that legally belonged to Creek Indians, displacing them, and selling the land for enormous profit. She described Marcus Webb's smuggling operation in detail, how he used legitimate cotton shipments to hide the transportation of enslaved people to markets where they would fetch higher prices, separating families and destroying lives for profit. She recounted Reverend Price's sermons about Christian charity, while he embezzled from his church's charitable fund to pay for his share in the consortium. And she testified about Samuel Harrison's plans to use his railroad connections to expand the slave trade westward, opening new markets and new territories to the institution. Her testimony was precise, detailed, and devastating. Then came the cross-examination. The defense attorney was Reginald Blackwell, one of the finest lawyers in the South. He was known for his ability to destroy witnesses on the stand. He approached Margaret with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Margaret," he began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "or should I say Miss, what is your proper title for a woman of your background?" "Miss Margaret is fine," she replied calmly. "Miss Margaret, you've told this court quite a story, a tale of heroism and justice, but isn't it really just a tale of a bitter woman seeking revenge?" "No, sir, it's a tale of crimes committed and documented." "Documented by whom?" "By a woman who was purchased for a specific purpose and who clearly resented that purpose. I documented the truth, regardless of my feelings about it." Blackwell's smile sharpened. "The truth? Let's discuss truth, shall we? Isn't it true that you were educated above your station, that you were taught to read and write when most of your race are not?" Wade objected. "Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's ability to manipulate information," Blackwell countered. The judge allowed it. "I was educated, yes," Margaret confirmed. "And isn't it true that this education gave you ideas above your natural place, made you resentful of your position?" Margaret felt anger flare but kept her voice steady. "My education allowed me to recognize injustice when I saw it. If that's what you mean by ideas above my place, then yes." "So you admit you were resentful, angry, looking for ways to harm your lawful owners?" "They weren't my owners. I'm a free woman now, and I wasn't looking to harm anyone. I was documenting crimes that were harming others." Blackwell pulled out one of Margaret's journals. "These journals, written in French, a deliberate attempt to hide your activities, weren't they?" "A practical precaution, yes." "Or evidence of deception, of a calculated plan to destroy honorable men?" "If they were honorable, there would have been nothing to destroy." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order. Blackwell's expression hardened. "Let's talk about Caroline, the woman you claim helped you, the woman who died during your escape." Margaret's chest tightened. "Isn't it true that Caroline was mentally unstable, that she had been in that household for 20 years and had developed fantasies about previous occupants?" "No, Caroline was the sanest person I knew." "Really? A sane person would have helped a piece of property escape, knowing it would lead to her death." "She helped a human being escape. And yes, That was the sanest, bravest thing anyone could do. Or perhaps, Blackwell suggested, Caroline was a troubled woman who filled your head with stories, and you, seeking attention and importance, elaborated those stories into this grand conspiracy. Margaret leaned forward. The documents speak for themselves, Mr. Blackwell. Bank records, shipping manifests, correspondence. Those aren't stories, they're facts. Facts that you claim to have copied from private documents. Documents you had no legal right to access. Documents that revealed crimes, Margaret countered. Would you prefer those crimes remain hidden because I wasn't legally permitted to see them? The questioning continued for 3 more hours. Blackwell attacked every aspect of Margaret's testimony, her character, her credibility. He suggested she was coached by abolitionists, that the journals were fabricated, that her entire story was designed to further the abolitionist agenda. But Margaret held firm. Every attack she met with calm, factual responses. Every attempt to trip her up she deflected with clarity and precision. Finally, Blackwell played his final card. Miss Margaret, you were purchased as a fancy girl. You know what that means. You were bought for the sexual gratification of white men. Isn't it possible that your resentment about this, understandable resentment, has colored your perception of everything else? The courtroom went silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when the victim was turned into the villain, when sympathy became suspicion. Margaret took a deep breath. She looked directly at the jury. Mr. Blackwell is correct about one thing, she said quietly. I was purchased for sexual gratification. I was assaulted repeatedly by 11 different men over 8 months. That was my reality. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. But that reality doesn't invalidate the truth of what I witnessed. If anything, it validates it, because those men talked freely around me. They revealed their secrets because they thought I was less than human. They thought I didn't matter. And that arrogance, that absolute belief in their superiority, is what allowed me to collect the evidence that sits before this court today. She locked eyes with Blackwell. My pain doesn't make me a liar. It makes me a witness to the cruelty and corruption that thrives when people are treated as property. And every word I've spoken in this courtroom is true, regardless of what you think of me. The silence that followed was absolute. When Blackwell returned to his seat, he looked rattled. Margaret had not only survived his cross-examination, she had emerged stronger. Over the next 3 weeks, the prosecution presented its case. Financial experts analyzed the documentary evidence Margaret had gathered. Federal investigators testified about the crimes they had uncovered. Former business associates, terrified of being implicated themselves, turned on the defendants and confirmed details from Margaret's testimony. The defense tried to argue that the defendants were being persecuted for their Southern values, that this was an attack on states' rights. But the evidence was overwhelming. The crimes were clear, documented, undeniable. On May 15, 1852, the jury returned with their verdict. Senator William Graves, guilty on all counts. Marcus Webb, guilty on all counts. Reverend Jonathan Price, guilty on all counts. Samuel Harrison, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Supporters of the defendants shouted in outrage. Abolitionists wept with joy. Margaret sat quietly, feeling the weight of 8 months, of Caroline's sacrifice, of 6 women who had suffered before her, finally lift. Justice had been served. The sentences were handed down the following week. Each man received significant prison time, 10 to 20 years, depending on the severity of their crimes. Their assets were seized to pay restitution to victims. Their reputations were destroyed. The gentleman's society was finished. But for Margaret, it wasn't over yet. 3 days after the verdict, Margaret sat in Thomas Whitmore's office, reading the newspaper coverage of the trial. Headlines from across the nation proclaimed justice served, corruption exposed, the beginning of real change. But Whitmore's expression was troubled. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked. "We won." "We won this battle," Whitmore said carefully. "But Margaret, there are hundreds of men like the ones you exposed. Thousands. The system that allowed them to buy and abuse you, that system is still intact." Margaret set down the newspaper. "I know. The question is, what do you do now? You're free. You could go north to Canada or England, build a quiet life away from all this. Is that what you think I should do?" Whitmore smiled slightly. "No, I think you're going to do what you've been doing all along, fight." He was right. Over the next several weeks, Margaret received invitations to speak at abolitionist gatherings throughout the North. At first, she was hesitant. Public speaking terrified her in ways that testifying in court hadn't. But then she received a letter that changed her mind. It was from a woman named Elizabeth, who had been enslaved as a fancy girl in New Orleans. She had read about Margaret's testimony in the newspaper. "You gave me hope," Elizabeth wrote. "For the first time I heard someone tell the truth about what happens to women like us. You didn't hide from it or soften it. You stood up and named it. Because of you, I found the courage to escape. Because of you, I'm free. Please keep speaking. Please keep telling the truth. There are so many of us who need to hear that we're not alone." Margaret read that letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she wrote to accept the speaking invitations. Her first public lecture was in Philadelphia, at the Mother Bethel AME Church. The building was packed with over 1,000 people, black and white, free and fugitive, all wanting to hear from the woman who had brought down the gentleman's society. Margaret stood at the podium, her hands shaking, looking out at the sea of faces. For a moment she couldn't speak. The weight of expectation, of hope, of responsibility felt crushing. Then she saw a young black woman in the front row, maybe 17 years old, with scars on her wrists that Margaret recognized. Restraint marks. This girl had been enslaved too, and she was looking at Margaret like she was seeing hope made flesh. Margaret found her voice. "My name is Margaret," she began, "and I was purchased to be a fancy girl for 11 wealthy white men who believed they owned me." The audience went silent. "I'm going to tell you the truth about what that means, not the sanitized version, not the version that makes people comfortable, the real truth, because comfort has never freed anyone." She told her story, all of it. The auction, the mansion, the assaults, the fear. She didn't spare the audience's feelings. She made them uncomfortable, made them confront the reality of what slavery actually meant for women. But she also told them about resistance, about Caroline's courage, about the small acts of defiance that became a campaign of justice, about using knowledge as a weapon when physical strength wasn't an option. "I couldn't fight them with violence," she said. "They were stronger, more numerous, armed, but I could fight them with truth, with documentation, with the very education they had given me to make me more refined for their purposes." She paused, looking out at the audience. "And that's what I'm asking all of you to do. Fight with truth. Speak it even when it's uncomfortable. Document it even when it's dangerous. Share it even when people don't want to hear it. Because the system of slavery survives on silence, on the idea that enslaved people are content, that fancy girls are willing participants, that the horrors are exaggerated or rare. But we know the truth. And if enough of us speak it loud enough, eventually the whole rotten system will collapse under the weight of its own lies." The applause when she finished was thunderous. People stood, shouting encouragement, crying, reaching out to touch her hand as she left the stage. But the most important moment came after, when that young woman from the front row approached her. "I was a fancy girl too," she whispered. "In Baltimore, I escaped 3 months ago. I've been too ashamed to tell anyone what happened to me, but you weren't ashamed. You told the truth." Margaret took the girl's hands. "What's your name?" "Anna." "Anna, it wasn't your shame to carry. It was theirs. And now we're going to make sure everyone knows it." Over the next 2 years, Margaret became one of the most powerful voices in the abolitionist movement. She traveled throughout the North, speaking to crowds that grew larger each time. She published a memoir, *11 Masters, a testimony of survival and justice*, that became a bestseller and was translated into multiple languages. But more importantly, she created a network, a support system for women who had been enslaved as fancy girls. She helped them escape, get education, find employment, testify against their abusers when they were ready. The network grew. What started as a few women meeting in Margaret's boarding house room expanded to chapters in major cities. They called themselves the Caroline Society, in honor of the woman who had given her life so the truth could be told. The Caroline Society did more than provide support. It gathered evidence. Just as Margaret had documented the crimes of her 11 masters, the women of the Caroline Society documented the crimes of hundreds of others. They created detailed records of who bought fancy girls, how they were abused, what laws were broken in the process. And they made sure that evidence reached prosecutors, journalists, and politicians who could act on it. The impact was significant. Dozens of men were prosecuted. The practice of openly advertising fancy girls at auctions decreased as the legal and social consequences increased. It didn't end the horror. Nothing could while slavery existed, but it made men think twice, made them afraid of being exposed. Fear, Margaret had learned, was a powerful motivator. In 1854, Margaret was invited to speak before Congress. The invitation came from a small group of abolitionist representatives who wanted to use her testimony to argue for stronger federal laws against the slave trade. Standing in that chamber, looking at the mostly hostile faces of congressmen who believed in slavery, Margaret felt the same fear she had felt on the auction block 3 years earlier. But she also felt something else. Power. "Gentlemen," she began, "I stand before you as living proof that the institution of slavery corrupts everyone it touches, not just the enslaved but the enslavers, not just the South but the nation." She spent an hour detailing the evidence the Caroline Society had gathered. She named names, powerful men who had purchased fancy girls, judges who had looked the other way, politicians who had profited from the trade. She made enemies that day, powerful enemies, but she also inspired allies. Her testimony was published in newspapers across the nation. It became part of the growing body of evidence that slavery was not the benevolent institution its defenders claimed, but a system of systematic cruelty and abuse. The speech didn't immediately change laws, but it changed minds, and changed minds eventually change everything. In 1856, Margaret received word that Elizabeth, the woman who had written to her years earlier, had successfully sued her former owner for assault. It was one of the first cases where a formerly enslaved woman won damages for abuse suffered while enslaved. The precedent was significant. It meant that even if slavery still existed, there were legal consequences for abuse. It meant that enslaved women were beginning to be seen as human beings deserving of protection, not property to be used at will. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough while the institution of slavery existed, but it was progress. As the nation moved toward civil war, Margaret continued her work. She helped over 300 women escape from slavery. She testified in dozens of trials. She published articles, gave speeches, and refused to be silenced. When the war finally came in 1861, Margaret was 44 years old. She spent the war years working with the Union Army, helping to establish camps for formerly enslaved people, advocating for their rights, ensuring they had access to education and opportunity. And when slavery was finally abolished in 1865, Margaret stood in front of the White House and wept. Not just for herself, but for Caroline, for the 6 women who had suffered before her, for Anna and Elizabeth and the hundreds of other women she had helped, for everyone who had survived, resisted, fought. Freedom had come. But Margaret's work wasn't finished. The end of slavery didn't mean the end of racism, sexism, or exploitation. There was still so much to fight for. So she kept fighting. She established the first school specifically for formerly enslaved women in Washington, D.C. She lobbied for laws protecting women's rights. She testified before Congress multiple times on issues ranging from labor rights to voting rights to education access. She never remarried, never had children. Her life was devoted to the cause, to justice, to making sure that what had happened to her and to so many others would never happen again. In 1892, at the age of 75, Margaret gave her final public speech at the dedication of a monument to Caroline. It was a simple stone marker in a Charleston cemetery, placed there by the members of the Caroline Society. "Caroline told me that knowledge was the only weapon I had," Margaret said to the small crowd gathered. "She was wrong about one thing: it wasn't the only weapon, but it was the most powerful one. The 11 masters who bought me thought they owned me. They thought they could use me and discard me. They thought I was powerless. But they forgot something important. They forgot that enslaved people are human beings. We think, we remember, we strategize, we resist, and when given even the smallest opportunity, we fight back. I didn't destroy those 11 men with violence. I destroyed them with their own words, their own arrogance, their own crimes. I simply held up a mirror and showed the world what they really were." She paused, looking at Caroline's grave marker. And Caroline gave her life so that mirror could be held up, so the truth could be told, so justice could be served. That's her legacy. That's our legacy. And it will continue as long as there are people willing to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. Margaret died peacefully in her sleep in 1895, at the age of 78. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, women she had helped, activists she had inspired, historians who had documented her work. The newspaper obituaries called her a hero, a pioneer, a voice for justice. But the most fitting tribute came from the women of the Caroline Society, who published a simple statement. Margaret was purchased to be silenced. Instead, she became a voice that changed the world. She taught us that our pain could become power, our suffering could become strength, and our stories could become weapons against injustice. We will carry her legacy forward. And they did. The Caroline Society continued for decades, evolving into organizations that fought for civil rights, women's rights, and human dignity. The network Margaret had built became a foundation for broader movements. The 11 masters who had purchased her believing they owned her became footnotes in history, remembered only for their crimes. But Margaret became a legend, the beautiful slave who had ruined them all, not with violence but with truth. And that truth echoed through generations, a reminder that power built on the suffering of others will always eventually fall. Because some voices once raised can never be silenced. The end.